CBS News law enforcement analyst Paul Viollis joins us now to talk more about this. Paul, you know, we spent the last couple of hours trying to understand, you know, why somebody would seek to do something out like this. I guess the question now is, that question is now for law enforcement. They've got to try to piece together what has happened and how did it happen. So what are some of the immediate steps that law enforcement are going to take as they begin to investigate this?
Right, Vlad. Well, you know, the next step, the next generation to this investigation is going to move from crime scene, gathering immediate information, trace evidence, looking at the internet, to now using that information to go to interviewing people. And what I mean by that is we're going to be able to ascertain in very short order who this individual had spoken to and communicated with. And from that point, those people will be interviewed. It's in concert with neighbors, friends, coworkers, colleagues, anybody that he was associated with. Again, using the information that they immediately had obtained. The next step is now sit down and interview people one-on-one. What did they know? When did they know it? How was that information made available to them? That is the next generation of this investigation. That's what's going to tell foreseeability in this particular case.
Okay, so we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but the idea that there's multiple people involved in this versus one person. When we were talking earlier to another one of our guests, one of the things that he mentioned that he thought that maybe would have made this guy very difficult to identify ahead of time was that perhaps he was a lone wolf. Because usually when you have a conspiracy and you have multiple people, the odds of you being found out before you can actually go through with the plot are pretty high. So, you know, what's your take on weighing like both options, that he's a lone wolf versus he would have needed help to pull this off?
Right. Well, a great question, Anne-Marie. When we talk about lone wolf, it's important for us to understand that what that means is that there's not a direct affiliation with a larger group. That doesn't mean that they haven't collaborated or been assisted by other individuals. It's very important for us to understand the distinction between that. And when we look at this particular individual, it's more than foreseeable. When we look at the fact that if we can ever make the connection between the author of the manifesto and this individual. But clearly, based on what we've seen already on this attack, this was well planned. You can't necessarily plan something that requires this amount of time, due diligence, on-site surveillance, and information gathering, as well as constructing the ordinances that he did, and to work on multiple locations without some type of assistance. I believe that we're going to see, yes, lone wolf, sure, not affiliated with a larger group, but there will be other people that will be identified as collaborating in this incident.
How difficult, Paul, will it be for law enforcement to understand if there is an ongoing threat in New Zealand? Because our Len Tepper from our investigative unit is reporting that the alleged shooter is claiming that there are other people willing to carry out attacks in New Zealand specifically. So now you're not only dealing with the follow-up to the investigation, you're trying to figure out who else may be threatening to do harm to the people of that country.
And can he be believed?
And not only can he be believed, but the question, I think, and it's what, when we were talking to Nadia Tolich, who's a reporter in New Zealand, you know, she wants to know as a reporter to the authorities, you know, how did this happen? And this is not, clearly the police in New Zealand are going to do their very best to try to piece this together, but they don't have a lot of experience with this.
No, in fact, that was one of the things that Nadia brought up, because we were really surprised to hear that it took maybe 20 minutes for emergency crews to get to the scene. And she said, we don't have guns like this. We don't have things like this happen.
So, now you're dealing with possible further acts of terror. How do you call on? I mean, I know the United States, the president has said the United States is standing by to help. Do you call on the U.S.? Do you call on neighboring countries to share whatever intelligence do you have? Do you bring some law enforcement from outside countries that have experience with this? For example, the New York Police Department, which deals with this on a constant basis. Do you bring some New York Police Department terror specialists to New Zealand? What's next?
The answer is yes, Vlad. When you look at New Zealand and law enforcement, has a rich history in collaboration. They are not going to be trumped by the fact that they are going to be concerned with their ego or appearance. They are going to reach out. I would be surprised, quite frankly, if they haven't reached out already. United States has prepared for this, but they prepared for it because we got sucker punched, we got beat up, and we realized that we needed to be more preemptive about this, which we are now. Now, in their defense in New Zealand, as you've said, they've never experienced this before. So collaboration will be key. Gathering information on how they can garner intelligence with respect to the propensity for future attacks that could be connected with this particular one, that's going to be at the top of the intel gathering list. And I think it's a very fair statement, Vlad, Anne-Marie, that that's ongoing right now. So to reach out to an NYPD, specifically someone like a Commissioner Miller, to reach out to somebody like the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, like people that we had Mary Ellen on before. Those are the people that New Zealand authorities are going to reach out to expeditiously, if they haven't done so already, to get their information, their methodologies, their plan of attack, if you will, on how they can expeditiously garner the information they need to make sure that they can preemptively prevent attack if there's one limbering out there right now.
Paul, let's talk about this manifesto that was uploaded. We keep repeating over and over again. I know it is getting repetitive, but we cannot confirm that this manifesto is directly connected to the actual shooter, but there's a lot of overlap here. I know you went through the manifesto, and every time I kind of look through it, because it's pretty long, you know, something else jumps out at me that's really fascinating. And what I'm starting to see are themes that we've heard before. And Vlad just brought that up. You reminded me of something, Vlad, when he talked about the Pittsburgh shooter and the idea of, you know, protecting our people, or, you know, this idea that our people are dying out because of these invaders. They're under attack. And he writes, you know, he writes sort of under the "Who are you?" question. He writes at the very end, you know, that he's just a regular guy, basically, that decided to take a stand to ensure the future of our people.
And you've got Steve King, as I pointed out. He said we can't restore our civilization with someone else's babies. That is from a member of Congress. In other words, you're listening to this information and receiving it at the highest levels. It's not just some random tweet on Gab.
So true.
It's an elected official of the United States talking like this.
So listen, talk to me a little bit about some of the themes that have jumped out when you looked at this manifesto.
Okay, well, Anne-Marie, Vlad, I'll tell you, one of the things, since we spoke in the last hour, that I found that really jumped out. Now, right now, we're looking at clearly hate begetting violence, begetting ignorance. But we're also looking at an attack on 2 mosques, our brother and sister Muslims out there that got attacked in this particular incident. Rest assured, though, in more than 2 locations that I've seen already inside this manifesto, and again, if in fact this manifesto, the author of it can be connected to the shooter. The author of the manifesto clearly states, and I'm quoting, "Jews won't replace us." Very similar, as Vlad mentioned a couple of minutes ago, to comments that we saw in Pittsburgh, to comments that we saw in Charlottesville. Something else that he mentions, the author of the manifesto mentions, which I found interesting, he blames European men for his position on this particular attack. And he says, getting ethnically replaced, unacceptable. So we go back to the site of, or the sense of the anti-immigrant and the other issues of invaders, replacement, conquer, and it talks about diversity. And it connects to the United States here. We talk about diversity as being rich, as being positive, as being powerful, which it is, because it's the backbone of the greatness of the United States and many other countries. He says diversity is nothing more than weakness. It weakens a society. So if that doesn't speak volumes about the author of this manifesto, I don't know what does. And last thing he mentions is cheap labor is slave labor. He talks about slaves quite a bit in this, and refuse to support modern slaves. He talks about immigrants, the way slaves were horrifically treated in the United States and in other countries. This basically tells us where this individual, the author of the manifesto's mantra, was developed from. No question.
It's just remarkable to me that he would have these sentiments, given that he's Australian and given that the original people of Australia were displaced by Europeans, and it's the same, the Aboriginal people in Australia displaced by Europeans, and then obviously in New Zealand, the Maori people are the indigenous people of that country displaced by New Zealanders. So in other words, I mean, he's an immigrant to his own country if he was actually born in Australia. It's something that I've struggled to understand that. I struggled with Mary Ellen O'Toole when we were talking about that, how somebody could feel that way because you're not even from the country that you claim is your land. Well,
you're speaking like there's supposed to be some logic behind all of this.
You're right.
The reality of it
I should stop.
Hate is without logic, right?
Indeed. And so, and I guess, Paul, for me, as we try to process this, and I guess that's probably what it is, right? Even though we're reporting the news to our audience, we want our audience to be informed. We are, as human beings, trying to process this information, trying to understand the mindset of people who would commit such heinous acts, and it's sometimes very difficult to do that, and we're doing it live on the air without a net. I guess the question for me going forward is, as law enforcement starts to think about this, look, the shooter, the alleged shooter put in his manifesto, he did say that there was something around the Second Amendment that he wanted to drive a discussion around.
One of his very last reasons why he did this had to do with fueling the division in this country over the Second Amendment. That's another theme, Paul, that we've seen before with these types of people. The idea that this horrific act of violence will then beget more violence, and that's a good thing.
And what's interesting about that, Paul, as you know, is that New Zealand it is a pretty gun-centric nation. They do have a lot of weapons there, but they don't have a lot of crimes or they don't have a lot of deaths by firearms in that country because, as the reporter that we spoke to, Nadia Tolich, you were listening to that, Paul said, most people keep it for sport or they keep it for other reasons other than what those weapons have been made to do, which is to kill. And so I wonder now, given that he's referenced a lot of things that are U.S.-centric, that to me is just as disturbing as the fact that there may be more potential attacks that are going to be, that may potentially be carried out in New Zealand, is the fact that he's referencing a lot of things in the United States almost as a signal to people in this country. Yeah,
well, Mary Ellen O'Toole, who, you're familiar with her, she's a former profiler, she felt that part of that was ensuring that the conversation about him doesn't remain localized. That, you mentioned our president, and so of course here in the United States we're going to start talking about it. But I am interested, with Vlad was asking you, what's your take on why there was so many references to America in there?
Well, because it's a great attention getter, Anne-Marie. And Vlad, also we've talked about this before, most terrorists, and this individual or individuals clearly qualify as a terrorist. And and the mantra for terrorism is act local, but think global. And more so, when you talk about involving the United States, you broaden the picture, you broaden the level of communication. You involve far more people than you would if you limit yourself to, I'm speaking solely about New Zealand. This guy, whoever this was, well, the shooter specifically, I'm again not making correlations to the author of the manifesto, but whoever, this shooter clearly has made it very clear that he wants to make a broad statement. The author of the manifesto wants to educate people on a global movement. So when we look at this, and Vlad, I was laughing when you were saying that because, as a highly intelligent man, a brilliant journalist, you're trying to make sense out of somebody that's never going to make sense. And our viewers sit there scratching their heads saying, this doesn't make sense, because our viewers here at CBSN, highly intellectual people. Certain things are simply not going to make sense. Hate begets ignorance, which begets violence, and quite frankly, there is absolutely no geographic boundary to hate. We're seeing that here in New Zealand.
I would say that you're right that my colleagues are brilliant and highly intellectual. My parents would argue not the same for me, but I thank you for the compliment. A bit of levity as we cover a horrific story. Not so smart here, but everybody around me is. That's why I'm so good at what I do. I got a lot of smart people around me. Like you, Paul. Thank you very, very much, as always, for your insight and analysis on a day of just horrific proportions. We appreciate it, as always.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Vlad, Anne-Marie.